Revenge with Avon. I learned early that in corporate America, people don't always stab you in the back. They smile first, make sure everyone is watching, then twist the blade where it looks like you handed it to them. The night this story truly began, I was standing alone in the glow of my apartment window, watching Manhattan rain slick the streets like a mirror, when my phone buzzed with the message that would change everything. Congrats, Olivia. Big day tomorrow. Don't be late. It was from Grant Harlan, the man who called himself my mentor and called me kid the way you pat a dog you plan to abandon. I stared at his name, felt that familiar pinch in my stomach, and told myself to breathe. I had worked for Harlan Systems for 6 years, climbed from a quiet analyst to the youngest strategy lead on the floor. I wasn't loud. I wasn't flashy. I didn't have the kind of family connections that open doors. I had grit, a habit of showing up early, and a small notebook where I wrote everything down, every promise, every meeting, every "we'll circle back." That notebook was my insurance policy. I just didn't know I'd need it like this. The next morning, I walked into the glass tower with my coffee and my best suit. The one that made me look like I belonged in rooms where people talked about synergy like it was a religion. The lobby was a cathedral of money, marble floors, clean lines, a wall of screens flashing stock tickers like a heartbeat. I should have felt proud. Instead, I felt watched. Security nodded too slowly. Reception smiled too tightly. When I reached the elevator bank, I noticed the new poster behind the concierge desk. Compliance is culture. The words were bold, cheerful, almost mocking. My stomach sank again. On the 37th floor, the air smelled like expensive cologne and burnt coffee. People moved fast, eyes down, avoiding each other like strangers on a subway. That's how you know something is coming. The conference room doors were open, and inside, the senior leadership team sat in a row, all polished smiles and clasped hands. At the center was Grant. Perfect hair, perfect teeth, perfect tie. He looked up like he'd been waiting for me to walk into my own trial. "Olivia," he said, too warm, "have a seat." I sat, the chair squeaking in the silence. That small sound felt like a scream. He didn't waste time. "We received a report," he said, tapping a folder like it was a weapon, that there were irregularities in the vendor selection for the Texas data center expansion. Texas. My project. The one I had built from scratch. The one I had flown out for, sweat through meetings, negotiated contracts, saved them millions. My heart thudded hard enough to hurt. Irregularities? I repeated, keeping my voice even. The general counsel, a woman named Diane with eyes like cold water, slid a paper across the table. "We have evidence you pushed the contract toward Red Mesa infrastructure due to a personal relationship," she said. The paper had my name at the top in bold letters, and beneath it, screenshots of emails that looked like mine. Messages that sounded like me, phrased with the same short sentences I used when I was busy. Only I hadn't written them. I knew it instantly. Like you know a voice isn't your mother's even if it says your name. My mouth went dry. "These are fake," I said. Grant leaned back, slow, satisfied. "That's a serious accusation," he replied, voice soft. "And we'd be happy to investigate. But for now, for the integrity of the company, we're placing you on administrative leave." Administrative leave. The corporate version of exile. The words hit me like a slap. I looked around for even one face that looked uncertain, one hint of sympathy, but all I saw were neutral expressions and cautious eyes. They'd already decided. The meeting wasn't for truth. It was for theater. "You can't do that," I said, and I hated the crack in my voice. Diane's tone didn't change. "We can, and we are." Security appeared at the door like they'd been waiting for their cue. Grant stood and smiled like a man handing out a promotion. "Olivia, don't make this harder than it needs to be," he said. "Let's keep it clean. Clean. Like a body scrubbed of evidence. like a reputation washed down a drain. I stood slowly, hands steady, and nodded as if I accepted it. Inside, I was shaking. Security walked me back to my desk as if I might steal a stapler and flee the country. Coworkers stared at their monitors, pretending not to see me, because fear is contagious here. When we reached my desk, the security guard said, "You have 5 minutes. 5 minutes to pack up 6 years of my life." I opened my drawer, fingers numb, and pulled out my notebook first. That little notebook, black cover, scuffed edges. The guard watched like it was contraband. I dropped it into my bag and grabbed a family photo that wasn't even family, just me and my best friend Nina at a street festival, both laughing like life was simple. Nina worked in procurement, 2 floors below, and she'd warned me weeks ago that Grant had been asking strange questions about my project. "He's sniffing around," she'd said, "like he's looking for a leak." I hadn't understood then. Now I did. As I rode the elevator down with security, my reflection in the mirrored walls looked pale, furious, and strangely calm. That calm scared me. It was the kind that comes right before a storm. Outside, the city kept moving. People hurried past, unaware that my whole world had cracked open. I walked 2 blocks before I realized I was still holding my access badge in my hand. My fingers wrapped around it like it could anchor me. Then my phone rang. "Nina. Liv," she whispered. "Tell me you're okay." I stopped under an awning, rain dripping off the edge like tears. "They put me on leave," I said. "They think I rigged the Texas vendor contract." There was a pause, a sharp inhale. "Oh my God," she said. I knew it. I knew something was off. "What do you mean?" I asked, voice low. "Procurement logs," she said. "Someone accessed the vendor scoring sheet after final approval. It wasn't you. Your credentials, maybe, but not you. I saw the timestamp. It was after you were on a plane. The air felt thin. Can you prove it?" I asked. "I can get you a screenshot," she whispered. "But Liv, they're scrubbing things." I tried to pull the audit trail yesterday, and it's weird. Like someone with admin access is cleaning it. Admin access. Only a few people had that, and Grant was one of them. My hands clenched. I pictured his smile. I pictured the folder on the table. I pictured the fake emails. The same pattern. Clean. Controlled. Planned. "Nina," I said, forcing my voice steady, "I need you to be careful. Don't email me anything from your work account. If they're watching, they'll bury you next." "I know," she whispered, "but I can't let this happen to you." My throat tightened. Because that's the thing about betrayal. It hurts worse when it comes wrapped in corporate branding and a fake smile. "Send it to my personal number," I said. "As a photo. No attachments. No trail." She agreed, and we hung up. I walked home like a ghost. Every sound too loud. Every face too sharp. I sat at my kitchen table and laid out everything I knew like evidence. I opened my notebook and flipped through pages of dates and quotes and meeting notes. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a movie board with red string. It was a woman with a pen, trying to protect herself in a world that rewarded men like Grant for knowing where to hide bodies. Then my email pinged. Not my work email, my personal. A message from HR. Reminder, you are prohibited from contacting clients, employees, or vendors during the investigation. A threat dressed as policy. My pulse spiked, but then something else rose beneath it. Anger, yes. Fear, yes. But also a stubborn, steady determination. Because I wasn't just fighting for my job, I was fighting for my name. And I'd seen what happens to women who are branded as difficult. You don't get rehired. You don't get believed. You become a cautionary tale whispered near coffee machines. That night, While rain tapped the windows like impatient fingers, I opened my laptop and logged into every personal archive I had. Old calendars, saved drafts, travel receipts, boarding passes. If someone wanted to frame me, they had to place me in the scene. But I had one advantage Grant didn't expect. I documented everything. When you grow up with nothing, you learn to keep receipts because you can't afford to lose. I pulled up my flight confirmation from the day procurement logs changed. Austin to New York. Departure, 6:15 p.m. procurement log change, 7:42 p.m. But the kicker was the Wi-Fi purchase receipt on the plane, timestamped. If someone used my credentials at 7:42 p.m., they did it while I was buckled in 30,000 feet above the ground, sipping ginger ale and trying to stay awake. I exhaled hard. Proof, but not enough. Corporations didn't care about proof unless it protected them more than it threatened them. And if Grant had set me up, he had a reason. Texas was a massive expansion. The contracts were worth tens of millions. The vendor selection could decide who got kickbacks, who got favors, who got promoted. If he could push me out, he could control the whole pipeline. And if he could make me the villain, he'd look like the hero who protected the company. I opened my notebook again and found the entry from 3 months ago. Grant asked me to keep Red Mesa warm, said they owe me. I remembered that meeting clearly. He'd been leaning against my doorway, grinning like we shared a secret. Just make sure Red Mesa stays in the mix, he'd said. They'll do right by us. I'd ignored it because I did things by the book. Now I understood. He'd wanted the contract. I'd blocked him without realizing it. So he built a story where I was the corrupt one. The next day, Nina sent me the screenshot, a blurry photo of a screen showing the procurement audit log, my username, and the timestamp that didn't match my reality. Beneath it, another line, admin override executed. My blood went cold, admin override. Someone with the keys had opened the door and walked in wearing my face. I texted her back, delete everything, now. She replied with a single word, done. For the first time since that conference room, I let myself cry. Not loud, not dramatic, just silent tears that fell onto the page of my notebook like ink stains. I cried for the humiliation of being escorted like a criminal. I cried for the coworkers who wouldn't meet my eyes. I cried for every late night I'd given this company, believing hard work would protect me. Then, when the tears stopped, I wiped my face and stared at myself in the dark laptop screen. My eyes looked different, sharper, older, like something inside me had clicked into place. I didn't have the luxury of collapsing. Grant had money, power, and a team of lawyers. I had truth, grit, and a notebook. So I did the one thing people like Grant never expect from a woman they try to erase. I started moving quietly. I called my old professor from business school, a man who now consulted on corporate compliance. I didn't tell him the full story, not yet. I asked one question. If someone is manipulating procurement logs, what's the cleanest way to prove it? He didn't hesitate. Independent forensic audit, he said. And you need leverage, Olivia. Companies only investigate the truth when the alternative is worse. Leverage. The word sat heavy. I hated the idea of playing dirty, but I hated injustice more. That afternoon, I drove to a tiny office in Queens, where a digital forensics specialist worked above a laundromat. His name was Marco, and his hands were stained with ink like he still wrote in notebooks too. I slid Nina's screenshot across his desk. Can you tell me what this means? I asked. He studied it, then looked up. Admin override logs are hard to fake completely, he said. If you can get even a partial export of the back end, we can trace the device, the IP, the session token. I don't have access, I said. Not anymore. Marco leaned back. Then you need someone inside, he said, or you need to force the company to preserve records. Preserve records. Legal language. I left his office with a list of steps and a new kind of fear, because now I wasn't just fighting a lie. I was walking into a system built to protect itself. That night, my phone buzzed again. A text from an unknown number. Stop digging. Take the severance. My chest tightened. Severance? They hadn't even offered it yet. Which meant this wasn't a random threat. Someone knew what I was doing. Someone was watching. The room felt suddenly too quiet. I checked the locks twice. I closed the blinds. I sat on my couch with my notebook in my lap like a shield. Then another message. You'll never work in this industry again. My hands shook, but my voice inside my head stayed steady. Let them try. Because here's the thing about women like me. We've been underestimated our whole lives. People think we'll fold if you scare us. They think we'll back down if you threaten our future. But they don't understand what it feels like to build your life from scratch, brick by brick, with no safety net below you. When you've climbed that far, you don't let someone kick you off the ladder without taking their hands with you. I went to my kitchen, poured a glass of water, and drank it slowly, forcing my body to calm down. Then, I opened my laptop and began drafting a timeline. Every meeting, every message, every travel date, every weird comment Grant had made. I wrote it all in one place, clean and clear, like a story that could be told to a judge. As I typed, I remembered something else. 2 weeks before all this, Grant had insisted on a private dinner. We should celebrate Texas, he'd said. You've done good work. At the restaurant, he'd ordered expensive wine and told me he had big plans for me. He'd talked about promotions, visibility, leadership. Then his hand had touched my wrist when he laughed, lingering too long. I pulled away, polite, careful. His smile had tightened for half a second. I told myself I was imagining it. Now I wondered if that moment mattered more than I'd thought, because revenge in corporate America isn't always about money. Sometimes it's about ego. Sometimes it's about a man who can't stand being told no. I added that dinner to the timeline. Then I called my mother. We weren't close, not like TV families, but she was steady in the way old trees are steady. She didn't panic. She didn't interrupt. She listened while I told her, voice-controlled, what had happened. When I finished, she said, "Do not beg them to believe you." I blinked. "What?" I asked. "You hear me," she said. "When someone wants you to crawl, standing is the only answer." I swallowed hard. "I don't know how to fight this," I admitted. She exhaled. "Yes, you do," she said. "You've been fighting your whole life. You just didn't call it that." After we hung up, I sat in the dark, thinking about that. About how I'd survived layoffs, moved cities with 2 suitcases, paid rent by skipping dinners, studied at night after 12-hour days. I had done hard things. This was just a new kind of hard. And somewhere beneath the dread, a small spark of hope flickered. Not naive hope. Not the kind you post on a wall in the office. The kind that lives in your chest when you refuse to accept the story someone else wrote for you. I looked at the unknown numbers thread again and took a screenshot. Evidence. Always evidence. Then I did something that felt like a miracle in slow motion. I opened a fresh page in my notebook and wrote a single line. If they want a villain, I'll give them a mirror. And right then, as if the universe wanted to remind me I wasn't alone, Nina texted me one more time from a new number. I found something bigger. Call me when you're alone. My heart pounded, but this time it wasn't only fear. It was momentum. It was the first taste of the truth pushing back. I stared at her message, then at the rain streaking down the window, and I realized the story wasn't about my fall. It was about what comes after. Because Grant didn't just frame me, he lit the fuse. And the thing about fire is, it doesn't always burn the person you pointed at. Sometimes it turns around and finds the one who started it. By the time Nina called, the sky outside my apartment was already bruised purple, the kind of evening that feels like it's holding its breath, and when I answered, her voice was tight but steady. Like she'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross, and she said, "Liv, I shouldn't even know this, but if I don't tell you, I won't sleep again." And my heart started racing before she even finished the sentence. Because when someone says that, you know the truth is about to get heavier. And she told me she'd been asked to help prep documents for an internal review committee that didn't officially exist yet. A quiet group pulled together before HR ever sent me that sterile email. And the documents weren't about vendor misconduct or compliance failures. They were about damage control, about how to position the Texas expansion fallout if the press ever caught wind. And right there in the draft talking points was a line that made my stomach drop. Rogue mid-level manager exploited oversight gaps. And beneath it, my title, my department, my name, reduced to a variable in someone else's script. And Nina whispered, "They decided it was you before they accused you." And I closed my eyes. Because that's when it finally hit me that this wasn't an investigation. It was a sacrifice. And I was the lamb they'd chosen to keep the machine clean. And as she kept talking, telling me she'd also seen budget reallocation requests tied to Red Mesa that bypassed standard approvals, signed. Off with Grant's digital signature, something clicked into place with a sharp, painful clarity. Because if Grant had pushed the vendor through after removing me, then the fake emails weren't just about framing me. They were about clearing his path. And I thanked Nina quietly and told her to stop, digging for now. Because I could hear the fear creeping into her voice, the fear of being noticed. And after we hung up, I sat there in the dim light, laptop open, notebook beside me, feeling the weight of how alone this fight could become if I wasn't careful. And that's when I made the first real decision of this war. I wouldn't fight them head on yet. I wouldn't march into HR with receipts and hope they'd suddenly grow a conscience. Because companies don't reward truth, they reward silence. So instead, I started building leverage the way Grant had, quietly, patiently, with a smile no one could see. And the next morning, I did something that felt both humiliating and empowering at the same time. I called a lawyer, not the flashy kind with billboards, but a woman named Rachel, who specialized in whistleblower protection and wrongful termination. And when she answered, her voice was calm in that way that makes you feel like panic is optional. And I told her everything, from the conference room to the fake emails to the admin override, and she didn't interrupt once. And when I finished, she said, "They didn't just accuse you, Olivia, they isolated you," which means there. Scared of what you might say, and I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, because being seen clearly felt like oxygen, and she explained the rules of the game in blunt terms, how corporations close ranks, how internal investigations are designed to protect the company first, and how my best move wasn't to prove my innocence immediately, but to force them into a position where ignoring the truth would cost them more than acknowledging it. And she used the word retaliation, and it landed heavy, because retaliation meant intent. It meant pattern. It meant I wasn't crazy for feeling targeted. And she told me to stop communicating with anyone at the company unless it was documented, to save every message, to assume every call was recorded. And then she said something that made my chest tighten with a mix of fear and resolve. If Grant touched your wrist after promising career advancement, that matters. And I stared at the wall, replaying that dinner in my mind, the way his hand lingered, the way his tone shifted when I pulled away, the way his smile cooled. And I hated how clear it all looked in hindsight, because it meant this wasn't just about contracts and money. It was about control, and when I hung up, I didn't feel relieved. I felt armed, and that afternoon, As if the universe was testing how far I'd go, HR called, and the woman on the line spoke in that careful, overly kind voice that feels like a trap, telling me they were moving forward with the investigation and asking if I'd be willing to cooperate fully, and I said yes, of course, because cooperation sounds harmless. But I followed it up with one sentence Rachel had coached me on. Please direct all future communication through my counsel. And there was a pause. Just a fraction of a second too long before HR said they'd note it. And when the call ended, I laughed, a short, sharp sound that startled even me, because for the first time, the power had shifted just enough for them to notice, and the text from the unknown number stopped that day, which told me more than any threat ever could, because silence can be louder than intimidation. And over the next week, I lived in a strange in-between state, not fired, not working, suspended in corporate limbo, while my name quietly turned toxic inside those glass walls. And I used that time the way people like Grant never expect women to use it. I prepared. I went through my notebook line by line, cross-referencing dates with emails, pulling old calendar invites, lining up flight receipts, and then I did something harder than all of that. I reached out to people I trusted who'd left the company, former employees, who had nothing to lose. And when I framed my questions carefully, asking about Grant, about Texas, about Red Mesa, patterns began to emerge like bruises under skin, stories of deals pushed too aggressively, of junior staff overridden, of concerns quietly dismissed, and one former project manager told me, if you ever block Grant, he doesn't argue, he waits. And that sentence stuck with me. Because waiting is what predators do when they know the system will work for them eventually. And with every call, my fear shifted into something colder and more focused. A kind of clarity that stripped the emotion down to its bones. And then, just when I thought I was as ready as I could be, the company made its next move. They sent me an offer, a neatly worded severance package with a generous payout, extended health care, and one small, deadly clause buried in the middle. Non-disparagement, no admission of wrongdoing on either side, mutual silence dressed up as fairness, and I stared at that document for a long time. Because it was tempting, the money would give me breathing room, it would let me walk away without a public scar, but it would also lock the truth in a box forever. And Grant would walk away clean, promoted, untouched, and in that moment, I realized the severance wasn't generosity. It was a bribe. And I forwarded it to Rachel, and her reply came back fast. This is your leverage. And she explained that companies don't offer money unless they're worried. And they weren't worried about me suing for lost wages. They were worried about what I could expose if I didn't disappear quietly. And that's when we made our move. Not publicly, not dramatically, but precisely. Rachel filed a formal notice alleging retaliation and requesting preservation of all digital records related to the Texas project, procurement logs, admin access records, internal communications, everything. And once that notice landed, the rules changed. Because destroying evidence after that point wasn't just unethical, it was illegal, and the silence from the company grew heavier, days passing without a word, until finally, HR scheduled a follow-up discussion, and I walked into that virtual meeting with my camera on, shoulders back, voice steady, and when Grant appeared on the screen, his smile was still perfect, but his eyes were sharp now, calculating, and, as the meeting unfolded, I watched him carefully, noting every deflection, every moment he spoke over me, every time he framed my concerns as misunderstandings, and I answered calmly, sticking to facts, dates, documentation, and when he said, "We all make mistakes under pressure," I replied, "I didn't," and the room went quiet, and I felt something shift again, Subtle but real, because men like Grant rely on women shrinking, on apologizing for existing, and when you don't give them that, they start to unravel, and after the meeting ended, Nina called me from a burner phone. Her voice, shaking with adrenaline, telling me that it had been instructed to lock down certain logs immediately after the legal notice. But it was too late, because backups existed, and one of the system admins, someone she trusted, had already flagged anomalies tied to Grant's credentials. And when she said his name out loud, I felt a strange mix of vindication and exhaustion wash over me, because proof is powerful, but it doesn't erase what it costs to get it. And that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my phone buzzed again, this time with Grant's name on the screen, a direct call. No intermediaries, and I let it ring, watching it until it stopped, because whatever he wanted to say privately didn't matter anymore. And the next morning, the story took another turn when Rachel called to tell me the company had agreed to an independent forensic audit, framed as a routine compliance step. And I smiled for the first time in weeks, not because I'd won, but because the trap was finally set. And as the days passed, bits of information filtered back, not officially, but through the quiet channels that always exist in places built on secrets, whispers of findings, of access logs that didn't align, of admin overrides traced to a device Grant used regularly, and with every whisper, the fear that had once dominated my thoughts loosened its grip, replaced by something steadier, something dangerous. Hope. Not the naive kind, but the kind that grows when you know. The truth is heavier than the lies holding it down, and still, I didn't celebrate. Because I knew this wasn't over. Because men like Grant don't go quietly, and corporations don't admit fault unless forced. And the real question wasn't whether the truth would come out. It was what the company would do once it did, who they'd protect, who they'd sacrifice, and where that would leave me. And on a rainy Thursday afternoon, as I sat at my desk at home, laptop open, timeline spread across my screen like a map of my own survival, Nina sent one final message that made my pulse spike all over. Again, they're panicking. Grant's been called into a closed-door meeting. No HR, no lawyers, just the board. I leaned back in my chair, heart pounding, rain tapping against the window like applause, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I allowed myself to imagine the ending not as a quiet exit, but as a reckoning. Because revenge, I was learning, isn't always loud. It's not always dramatic. Sometimes it's patient, methodical, and devastating in its precision, and whatever happened next, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Grant had underestimated me, and in doing so, he'd given me exactly what I needed to take everything he thought was untouchable. The call came late, the kind of late that makes your phone feel heavier in your hand before you even answer it, and when Rachel spoke, her voice was calm but edged with something I hadn't heard before, a quiet satisfaction, and she said, "They have enough," and for a moment I didn't respond, because my body didn't know how to process relief without suspicion. Because after weeks of living in survival mode, peace feels like a trick. And she explained that the forensic auditors had traced multiple admin overrides directly to Grant's secured laptop. Overrides executed during times when he claimed to be off-site. Overrides that conveniently aligned with the creation of the fake emails and the manipulation of procurement scores. And more than that, they'd uncovered internal messages where he discussed managing Olivia out once the Texas deal was locked, language cold and strategic, as if I were a line item to be adjusted, and I closed my eyes as she spoke, not because it hurt, but because it confirmed something deep in my bones, that I had never imagined any of this, that the unease I'd felt for months had been my instincts trying to protect me. And Rachel continued, explaining that the board was split, some wanting to quietly terminate Grant and bury the report, others worried about exposure, about regulatory scrutiny, about what would happen if I decided not to stay silent. And that's when she said the words that shifted everything. They want to. Talk settlement. Real settlement. With acknowledgement. And I laughed softly. Not out of joy, but out of disbelief. Because the same company that had escorted me out like a criminal now wanted to negotiate my silence with respect. And I told her I'd think about it. Because power is knowing you. Don't have to answer right away. And when the call ended, I sat there in the fading daylight, thinking about the strange road that had led me here, about how close I'd come to taking that first severance offer just to make the pain stop, and how doing so would have erased the truth forever. And my phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Nina. He's done. And I didn't ask what she meant, because I could hear it in her words, the release, the disbelief, the weightlifting. And later that evening, the news trickled out quietly through industry channels. Not headlines, not scandals, just whispers that Grant Harlan had resigned effective immediately, that the Texas expansion was under review, that leadership changes were forthcoming. And as I read those words, I felt a hollow satisfaction, because resignation is the corporate word for exile, and it meant he wouldn't get to stand on a stage and explain himself. He wouldn't get applause or sympathy. He'd simply vanish from the building he once ruled. And still, I knew this wasn't the end for me, because removal doesn't equal justice, and silence doesn't equal healing. And a week later, I sat across from the company's legal team in a glass conference room that looked painfully similar to the one where my nightmare had begun, only this time, I wasn't alone. Rachel sat beside me, steady and unflinching, and when the general counsel spoke, her tone was careful, acknowledging process failures and misconduct by a former executive, and then, finally, the words I'd needed to hear. We acknowledged that Olivia was wrongly accused, and my chest tightened, because those words don't rewind time. They don't erase humiliation, but they restore something fundamental, your name. And they offered more than money. They offered a written statement clearing me, a neutral reference letter reviewed by my counsel, and a commitment to revise their compliance oversight. Changes that would outlive me, and I agreed, not because I wanted to protect them, but because I wanted to close the door without, leaving my soul behind it. And when I walked out of that building for the last time, the sun was bright and unforgiving, and I realized I was smiling, not because I'd won in the way movies depict, but because I'd survived without becoming someone I didn't recognize. And the aftermath was quieter than I expected. No parade, no dramatic applause, just the slow work of rebuilding, of updating my resume, of answering interviews where I chose my words carefully. And I learned something unexpected during that time, that telling the truth doesn't always require telling every detail. Sometimes it's enough to know it yourself. And then 3 months later, an email landed in my inbox from a company I'd admired for years, a competitor to Harlan Systems, one that had watched the Texas expansion closely. And the subject line read, Leadership Opportunity. And as I read through it, I felt that old spark of excitement tempered by something new, wisdom. Because I knew now what ambition can cost if you don't protect yourself. And during the interview process, I was asked directly about my departure, and I told the truth in a single sentence. I was retaliated against for doing my job correctly, and an independent audit confirmed it, and there was no awkward silence, no skepticism, just a nod, because the industry had heard the whispers too, and when the offer came, it wasn't just a job, it was authority, a chance to build teams differently, to create systems where one person couldn't rewrite reality for their own benefit, and I accepted, not out of revenge, but out of resolve. And on my first day, as I walked into my new office, sunlight pouring through windows that didn't feel like mirrors, I placed my old black notebook in the top drawer of my desk, not as a weapon anymore, but as a reminder. And weeks later, when I ran into Nina for drinks, she looked lighter, freer, and she told me she'd transferred departments, that she no longer felt like she was constantly watching her back. And we toasted quietly, not to victory, but to truth. And occasionally, when I scroll through industry news, I see Grant's name pop up in small ways, consulting gigs that never quite materialize, advisory roles that quietly disappear, and I feel no urge to gloat, because the greatest revenge I learned wasn't watching him fall, it was watching my own life rise without his, shadow over it. And if there's one thing I carry forward from this, it's the knowledge that silence can be survival, but voice is power, and when you choose to use it carefully, deliberately, it can dismantle empires built on arrogance. And as I sit here now telling this story, I don't feel anger anymore. I feel clarity, because karma doesn't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it shows up as a closed-door meeting, a preserved log file, a woman who refuses to disappear. And that's the miracle people don't talk about, the quiet kind. The kind where you don't just get your job back, you get yourself back, stronger, steadier, and finally unafraid to stand in the truth. And if you're listening to this and you feel alone in a system that's trying to break you, remember this. They only win if you vanish quietly. And I didn't. And neither do you have to.
Appreciate you sticking around. Smash that subscribe button. I'll catch you in the next story. Take care.